Hello, friends, and thank you for joining us for this IEA webinar, Up in Smoke, the Future of UK Tobacco Harm Reduction. My name is Christopher Snowdon. I'm the Head of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. You could be out drinking in the park with 5 friends today, but you've instead chosen to spend the next hour with us, for which we are very grateful indeed. And I'm very grateful indeed for our 3 guests for joining us today. I will just introduce them. Firstly, we've got Martin Cullip. He is a transport company director, and he's a chair of the new Nicotine Alliance, which is a consumer association educational charity involved in tobacco harm reduction. And we have Clive Bates. He's the director of Counterfactual, a former civil servant and a former director of Action on Smoking and Health here in the UK. And last but not least, we have Mark Pawsey, who is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Rugby, has been since 2010. Since September 2017, he's been a member of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee, and he is the chair and a founding member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Vaping. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. So just in case viewers, you're not aware of what I mean by tobacco harm reduction, we're essentially talking about nicotine products that are significantly less harmful than cigarettes. In the UK, by far the main device is the e-cigarette, and the UK actually has really flown a flag for vaping over the years. The government has been relatively supportive, certainly compared to a lot of countries around the world, some of which have banned vaping altogether. And we've seen the rewards of that. You know, we've had a really significant drop in the smoking rate since around about 2012, when e-cigarettes became a mainstream product. However, in the last few years, things have not been going backwards, but kind of flatlining. The revolution seems to be petering out a little bit, and a lot of that is down to public attitudes. I was reading the Eurobarometer survey a few weeks ago. It's really quite shocking to see people's understanding of vaping in particular going backwards. There's more and more people believing wrongly that vaping is as bad or even worse than conventional smoking than there were a few years ago. You know, people essentially were better informed 10 years ago when they knew almost nothing than they are today. And the same is true to a lesser extent, admittedly, but the same is true in England. In 2014, 36% of the public thought that vaping was as bad or worse than smoking, and that's risen to 53%. Less than a third of the English population, according to this survey, correctly believes that vaping is less dangerous than smoking. 40% of the public think that nicotine causes cancer in England. That's actually quite a low rate compared to a lot of countries around the world. The USA's had a really big moral panic and scare about vaping. That seems to have seeped into the conversation in the UK and in Europe. In Europe, only 20% of people think that vaping helps smokers quit. That's a low figure compared to England, but we can't be complacent in England, in Britain, and there is an opportunity to do something about this, and that's what I really want to get into today. We've just heard today about the Office for Health Promotion has been created to take on the health promotion work that Public Health England was doing. Public Health England's been a great ambassador actually for vaping over the years, so would like to get my panelists' thoughts on what's going to happen with this new agency. And of course, we've had Brexit, and the only really kind of negative regulation on e-cigarettes in this country has come originally from the EU. We could get rid of it. Will we get rid of it? If the EU brings in more regulations, will we follow suit? Martin, if I could start with you for your opening remarks, please.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on this, Chris. Just to briefly explain, the NNA is, as you said, a charity and consumer organisation. We advocate for the availability of safer nicotine products for smokers who choose to quit. I thought I'd start by just expanding around harm reduction as a principle. Harm reduction is not just restricted to tobacco. It's policies, programs and practices that aim to minimise harm. That's the definition. Many people might have heard of some of these policies from drug harm reduction, such as needle exchanges. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about pill testing at festivals. Condoms are a harm reduction idea. You know, you don't want to stop people having sex. You just want to make sure they're doing sex safely. And seatbelts, of course. You know, you don't want to stop people driving. It seems to be quite well known, quite well known in different areas, that harm reduction is the way to go if you have people engaging in risky behaviour or dangerous practices, just to reduce harm. But for some reason, there's a stigma around harm reduction towards tobacco. This is kind of mirrored the fact that drugs has had the same problem over the years. It took ages before people would accept the idea of something like safe injecting rooms, that kind of thing. But I don't know why there is this problem with harm reduction in tobacco. Maybe it's just the smokers. I don't know. But I'd like to say why it is important, because, for example, on Conservative Home just the other day, there was a very good article from David Jones MP. And every time I see one of these articles, there's always someone underneath says, of all the problems we've got in this world and all the issues we've got, housing, education, and you're talking about vaping. It's not important. And yet I don't understand why people say it's not important, when it's important to have, when a smoking ban comes around, it's vitally important the government gets involved. They have to have taxation. There's always a ticking time bomb of people smoking. And yet when you talk about something like vaping, which could save millions of lives all over the world, and other harm reduction products, for some reason it's now not important. It is vitally important because it affects people's lives. And we advocate for this being recognised in the policy area of tobacco, just like it's recognised in many other policy areas which are not to do with tobacco. Harm reduction is an argument about saying, if people don't want to stop a certain behaviour, if they're not going to stop, they can't stop or they won't stop, then let's find a way of making do it in a safer way. And that's what all this is about. Like Chris said, there are opportunities coming up. The UK has been a world leader on this, but we think they can probably do better. And there are opportunities with Brexit, which we've made some recommendations on. I'm not going to go into those yet. I'm sure they'll come out at some point during the discussion, but that's my start anyway.
Thanks very much, Martin. I should just say to the viewers at home, or wherever you are, probably at home, that you can add your questions. Go to the Q&A function. If you're in Zoom, you can't do this if you're just watching on YouTube, I'm afraid, but if you're watching on Zoom, go to the Q&A, stick your question in there, and you can also upvote any other questions you like, and I will try to give them priority later on when we come to the Q&A, because I broadly believe in democracy. Clive, what are your thoughts on the state of things?
Well, I just thought I would try and say something about where the opposition comes from to this, which is from a bizarre place, actually. We don't have it too badly in England, in the UK, but worldwide the situation is terrible, and certainly there's a lot of hostility to tobacco harm reduction in the United States, and a lot of that flows across the Atlantic as contagion of public opinion here in the UK. I mean, on the face of it, we have an amazing public health success story. I mean, smoking is still, really bad thing. Still 1 in 7 adults smoke. It's highly concentrated in poorer groups, in the most disadvantaged populations. Here we have alternatives, a suite of alternatives, not just vaping, but also snus, nicotine pouches, heated tobacco products that are non-combustible, are by any reading much, much less dangerous than the smoke products. And they are economic alternatives. They're economic substitutes for them. In other words, people buy them instead of buying cigarettes and switch to them as a way of using nicotine instead of smoking, often over time, but that's more or less what's happening. We've got good evidence that they work in the conventional sort of smoking cessation way, as if they were a kind of pimped up NRT, but they also work in a different way, which is, instead of just helping somebody get from smoking to being abstinent by helping with withdrawal and cravings, which is what smoking cessation medications do, they actually work in a different way, which is by offering a pleasurable alternative experience to smoking. And that's the key thing to understand. The public health mechanism is about a rival value proposition. It's about doing something that smoking like, has many of the attributes of smoking, but is at very, very much lower risk. And that makes it easier for people to switch than going to abstinence. In some countries, there's a sort of youth vaping problem, but to be honest, in the grand scheme of youth risk behaviors, it's pretty minimal. Most of the people using these products are also smokers, and they're putting vaping in the mix, which is probably a good thing for them rather than a bad thing. So there's not too much to worry about. Yet there has been the most extreme opposition. It can, millions of dollars. Bloomberg's put in hundreds of $millions into opposing these developments. The Union, one of the biggest cancer organizations in the world, favors outright bans on these products in low and medium income countries. WHO applauds every time a country bans something. It almost like rings a bell every time there's a new prohibition comes in. Where is that coming from? And I think there's three possible explanations for it. The first is that it is very countercultural within the world of tobacco control. So if you take the main explanation for how this works, it's in the interplay of pleasure-seeking customers and profit-seeking entrepreneurs and innovators. It's a market-based private sector transaction. And that is not something that, the doyens of public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine would regard as a typical way that you get, public health gains. And I think they are in the playbook for tobacco control. You'll find a lot of tools, but they're all kind of coercive, punitive, restrictive, stigmatizing, controlling. I mean, it's not called tobacco control by accident. And this is strongly countercultural to that. This is about, free choice, the marketplace, and so on. And I think they're just throwing out antibodies because they hate that way of doing things. That's the first reason. The second reason is that there is a fairly formidable institutional infrastructure that has been built up to fight the tobacco industry and tackle smoking. For my sins, I've been part of that, and my concern has always been about the burden of cancer, heart disease, COPD, the things caused by smoke. But that infrastructure is very large and is not going anywhere. The smoking issues become difficult, boring, concentrated in marginal groups, and I think it's just swiveled its firepower onto the new thing and is now blasting away at the new thing using the old model. And I think institutional inertia explains quite a lot of what's going on. And then my third reason is that I think there has always been different objectives in tobacco control and public health. People like me are worried about cancer and heart disease, COPD, and all the rest of it. Others have been worried about, bystanders being affected by smoke. The smoke-free, non-smokers' rights type origins of tobacco control. And I think underlying and coming to the fore now, there's also a sort of drug prohibition thing. The idea that somehow using the drug nicotine is an unclean and dirty, compromising, inferior way to live. Even though the people who would say that will be quite happy having a glass of wine with their dinner, a nice, beer after work or whatever. And as you know, at IEA, drug use of one sort or another is pretty well ubiquitous in society. But there's a particular prejudice for that one, which I feel is probably class-based. It's probably because it's a drug of choice concentrated particularly in the poor. And there's a kind of disgust and stigma associated with that. So that's my reasons why I think there's opposition. And it is phenomenal. The institutions that they've got caught up, the money involved, the researchers, the regulators and so on. It's really quite a powerful assault on what is actually basically a good thing.
Thanks, Clive. And Mark, I mean, this is all what Clive says, of course, is very true, but not in England. In England, in Britain in general, we've really tried to educate the public. And yet, as the statistic I mentioned before, more than half of the population now thinks that vaping is as bad or more dangerous than smoking. What do you think's gone wrong, and how can we fix it?
A number of things, Chris, but I wonder if I could start off by explaining what an all-party parliamentary group is and why we set one up for vaping. So there are about 500, I think, all-party parliamentary groups representing all sorts of interest, countries and sports. And I was involved in setting up an all-party parliamentary group in 2014. And I'm not a vapor or a smoker, and I've never used either. But there's a young man in my office who had wanted to quit smoking for a number of years. He tried patches, he tried gums, nothing had really worked for him. And he found a local independent retailer who provided him with a vaping device and matched the flavor and strength of the vaping device he was using to enable him to quit smoking. And he used to bring his device into the office and say, I've just been down to see my retailer. Really bad news. There's a real concern he's going to have to close because of some directive that's coming through from the EU called the Tobacco Products Directive. And the crazy thing is that, you know, these devices don't contain any tobacco. So why are they being affected by the Tobacco Products Directive? And I went down to meet this retailer, and I saw how there was a consultation taking place between his staff and a potential vapor, by getting to understand how long the people had been smoking, what variety of cigarettes they were using, what the nicotine strength was, how heavy a smoker they were, and tailor making a product to suit their particular needs. And we then got on to, well, how is this represented in Parliament? And frankly, it wasn't. There was a lot of ignorance in Parliament. So what we thought a good way of raising awareness amongst parliamentarians would be to set up an all-parliamentary group, and we invited suppliers to bring different devices in, and so that MPs could come along and have a look at what was available on the market. And I know Martin was probably one of our regular attenders in the early years, and because this is an emerging, developing market, there was no forum for users and consumers to engage with manufacturers, distributors and suppliers. And so at one point, I think we were the best attended meeting in Westminster, because we perhaps have 100 people in a room wanting to engage. That's matured and developed now, and we now have a consumer organisation such as the one Martin represents, who come to speak to us, and then other groupings that represent the manufacturers and the retailers. And as an all-party group, we've done a number of inquiries. We looked in 2017 at what we call the state of the vaping nation, which was sort of a marking time as to where we'd got to. And in 2018, we did a report about vaping in workplaces and public places, where we argued that the decision as to who should determine what policy is in a building should be down to the building operators. And we were very keen to try and improve flexibility for vapers in Parliament, because in many cases, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why take-up has stalled, is that far too many people are equating the harm from smoking with vaping, so that people see the two things side by side. And you can go into a public building and it'll say, smoking isn't permitted in this building, and by the way, neither is vaping. And the more people see signs like that, the more they equate the two activities. And in fact, Public Health England have just last month published a report, which is, I think, Chris, where your stats have come from, where they found that 38% people believe that vaping was as harmful as smoking. 80% didn't know, but 15% of smokers believed that vaping was more harmful than smoking. So the thing is turned upside down. It's the wrong way around. We know that the harm in smoking is from the smoke inhalation into the lungs and the other activity, what comes along with that smoke. That's where the danger is. And we know that some years ago, Public Health England's report showed that vaping was 95% safer than smoking. But that message seems to have got lost. And the more so what do we need to do? We need to change some of these signs and accept that smoking isn't possible in the building, but that vaping is a totally separate issue. The two should not be equated. And the interesting thing is, we're now about to publish a report. We held an inquiry over the last couple of months about the role of the World Health Organization, and I hope we'll come on to talk about that in a bit more detail, because the WHO does seem to have it in for vaping, and has an attitude that vaping is correlated with smoking. And one of the points about our report was to get a message to government that at the next meeting of the Council of the Parties, which takes place in November, so not very long away, we need a strong voice from the UK articulating what you've described, Chris, is that the UK has had a much more positive attitude to vaping, and we need to be taking a lead. And one of the issues is that the UK is a very big funder of the World Health Organization. And if we're going to be putting a lot of money into it, we need to make sure that our voice is heard louder than it's been heard recently, because there's a grave danger that this WHO meeting will equate vaping with smoking, and the rates of take-up will continue to fall, and we will end up looking at, the noughties between 2010 and 2020 as being when the market developed, but then became a solely small niche product and doesn't get taken up anymore. And if we want people to come off smoking and avoid the harm that smoking gives them, we need more people to take up vaping.
Thanks very much, Mark. And let's indeed continue on the theme of the WHO and the Conference of the Parties. Martin, I mean, most people don't really think very much about the WHO, or they haven't done until the last year. It's had a bit more of a critical appraisal since the COVID pandemic began. But, the WHO, which many people won't even realize has a particular view on vaping, it doesn't actually legislate. It can't force governments to pass laws as such. So why should we care about what it thinks of vaping? And can you just explain what the COP meetings are exactly?
The COP meetings are there is a legal treaty, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which I think was signed in 2003, and it's a huge legal treaty. I think it's got about 180 countries signed up to it, and they work by producing consensus around policies towards tobacco control. Now, these policies have always tended to be coercive. They're aimed at higher taxation, putting more warnings on packaging, stopping the illicit trade, stuff like that. But they also do have in their preamble a policy that says that they would accept harm reduction, but they don't seem to be making much effort at honouring that. So what we seem to have now is, as Clive said, tobacco controllers who are used to certain methods in their tanks and their, like I said, firing away at tobacco industry, and now they've just pivoted those onto harm reduction products, and they're extremely stubborn. Like you said, Chris, the evidence is overwhelmingly towards how much safer these products are. And yet they've abandoned the harm reduction idea completely, and they're just trying for outright elimination. Where the threat occurs is because they're looking for a consensus and a global consensus, and they are targeting, predominantly at the moment, low and middle income countries. Where it could affect us is if it is seen that we are an outlier somehow, and there's a global consensus on wanting to stop these products, and that they're a gateway and all these things that they throw out to try and scare everyone, then it doesn't take much in politics for things to switch. And obviously we need the government in this country to stay strong. We are a global leader in this. And like Mark says, we need our government to go along in November to The Hague, this COP meeting, and extol the virtues of harm reduction and say how successful it's been here. It's no good for them, as David Jones said in his Conservative Home article just last week, we shouldn't just go along to get along. We should be going along there and saying, look, you need to bang your heads together here, and you need to come up and see what we're doing in this country. Harm reduction is a valid option. If you want to attract more people away from smoking, then you need to give them these available products, safer products, make them available, and a suite of products, not just vaping. We know a lot about vaping here, but in places like Japan and Korea, heated tobacco has taken off and has completely changed the market over there. And other areas such as Nordic countries, they've got snus, which has led to Sweden having by far the lowest smoking rates and cancer disease rates or smoking related disease rates in Europe. And yet snus, which is the product they use, is banned all over the EU, including this country. And one of our recommendations, obviously post-Brexit, is that we should lift that ban. So there are other things we do, but the main thing, as Mark said about the WHO, is the British government delegation has to go along and stand up for the UK and stand up for our policies. They are successful. We know they're successful. We know they work, and they should stand their ground and tell the WHO that in November.
And Clive, I mean, it seems to me that the best thing we could do at this point is to repeal the EU's e-cigarette regulations, legalize snus, and turn up at The Hague saying, if you don't start playing ball, we're going to take away our money. But that's probably not very likely to happen. What do you think is a reasonable ask? You're a reasonable man. What do you think is a realistic goal for us to set?
Well, it's a good question, Chris. I mean, first of all, there's a set of Brexit questions in general about the extent to which the UK is able and willing to diverge from EU regulation. And I don't think we're yet at the point where that is now stabilized and we know what that relationship will be. Hopefully, in this case, it will be one where we allow the UK to diverge from whatever the EU does, because there is definitely scope for improvement on those directives. But do bear in mind the Tobacco Products Directive it's certainly not a good directive, but it's a lot better than a lot of the stuff that has come in around the world, for example, in the United States. If we had the US system, we'd be in a right mess now. Also, if we'd had the system that the EU proposed and the UK proposed, which was to regulate all of these products as medicines, that was their position back in 2013, we'd be in a terrible state now. And thank goodness we were saved by the European Parliament from a fate as bad as that. But there are things that should be done, whether they will be done. So basically the key policy distinction that should be made is not between tobacco products and non-tobacco products, between vaping and smoking. It should be between smoke-free products and non-combustible and combustible products. As far as I'm concerned, you should carry on with reasonable degree of regulation, not to the point where you hurt people with that regulation or hurt them anymore, at least. But the approach to all the non-combustible options, that's the nicotine pouches, the vaping products, the heated tobacco products, and the smokeless tobacco products like snus, should be much more liberal and should be about containing and controlling risks rather than banning things or heavily restricting things. Now, my guess is it will be easier to win that argument for the products that don't involve tobacco, because tobacco brings a kind of red mist down on people, even though the big proof of concept is on snus in Sweden, where the results are amazing. And I noticed there's a question about that, which hopefully we'll come back to. But the results are amazing. I mean, smoking prevalence in Sweden is 7% now, daily smoking 5%. If we could get down to that sort of level, maybe not using snus as the alternative nicotine delivery, but a range of all of those products, that would be one almighty big public health win. The logic is to do it for all the non-combustible products, but I just feel the kind of spinelessness of the Department of Health, the nervousness about appearing to liberalize on tobacco. The logic would be that you should, allow advertising of heated tobacco products. You should reduce the tax on heated tobacco products and smokers, lift the ban on snus. Whether Parliament, it'd be interesting to get Mark's take on that, whether Parliament has the kind of courage to do what's right on the non-combustible tobacco products is where I would be less confident. I doubt we will come back too far from the TPD2, but hopefully if anything stupid happens in a future TPD3, we won't follow the EU down that track, banning flavors, requiring authorization or any of these other things. So not doing bad things in the future might be a bigger win than a complete rehash of tobacco policy. Finally, the government wants to get its 2030 smoke-free target, by which it means smoking prevalence below 5%. It has to get a reduction in smoking that's twice as rapid as it achieved in the decade 2010 to 2020, in the current decade. That's not going to happen just by carrying on with conventional tobacco control. They have to do something new, different, ambitious, bold, and that's what I think they should do: liberalize the non-combustible tobacco and nicotine options.
Thanks, Mark. Can you come in on that? So politics is the art of the possible. What do you think is possible?
I think Clive's right about the distinction between vaping and other non-combustible tobacco products, and so the APPG focuses on vaping. And we in addition to his Conservative Home article, David Jones led a debate in Parliament in one of the Westminster Hall debates last week, where we were able to refer to the Public Health England report and to the report that we're doing, and being able to engage with public health ministers. Now, one of the challenges we've had all along throughout the years since the APPG has existed is getting a public health minister to come along and talk to us. But I think step by step, we're getting closer to being able to make that contact. And it is interesting, actually. We have had some success amongst parliamentarians. Kevin Barron was a Labour MP who spent much of his parliamentary career fighting the tobacco industry and fighting the harm that can come from combustible tobacco. And he left Parliament in 2019, but in the year or two before he left, he actually became an active member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group and turned his view around 180 degrees, recognising that vaping is the only method of smoking cessation which works, which people stick with. And one of the critical things, it seems to me, is that people hold a vaping device in much the same way as they would hold a cigarette. Part of the enjoyment in the style around smoking is the holding of something in your hand, the inhalation, and that's led to people being more successful. And I agree totally with Clive that, I mean, we're not saying there should be no regulation. I mean, people are ingesting gases into their lungs. It is too easy, and it exists at the moment, of people mixing chemicals and flavors together in their garage, and then perhaps selling them on a Sunday market, on a street market, where there is no regulation. That we want to see good, effective regulation. And the advice I would give to anybody who's thinking about taking vaping is buy from a reputable source. Make certain that it's a good, reliable supplier, rather than somebody who's mixing something in a backstreet location. So we don't want no regulation. We want effective and fair regulation. And there are a couple of completely crazy things within the TPD. The first is the size of bottle that the liquids can be sold in. I'm also chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the packaging industry, and lots of these small bottles are great for that sector because they're providing many, many more bottles. Absolutely. And the other is the strength of the nicotine within the liquid. And there are lots. I spoke about the consultation that the small retailer in Rugby gave, and if somebody's a heavy smoker, they're going to need a bigger nicotine dose than somebody who's a light smoker, and there's a limit on the amount of nicotine that can be available, and that means that for some people who switch, it doesn't work for them, and they go back to tobacco. That can't be in anybody's interest. And if we were really brave, we might be able to allow people who produce these devices that work to communicate with people who aren't currently consuming the product about the benefits, which is essentially what advertising is about. I don't think Parliament is ready to do that yet, but we certainly need to get more people on our side, and we do need to do something about arresting the decline in take-up of vaping products, and the fact that smoking levels are stabilising. And you're right, the government's got an objective to get smoke-free by 2030 without some action by government to say, some further action by government to say vaping is a way of doing that. I can't see any way we're going to achieve that.
I'm going to go to the questions in a few minutes, but just before we do, one more thing. This is a sort of breaking news segment, because this morning Matt Hancock announced that the Office for Health Promotion is going to be up and running by the autumn. So Public Health England has essentially been, well, closed down and split. Its duties have been split between, I think it's now called the Health Security Agency. It was originally called the National Institute for Health Protection, but it's been renamed even before it's come into being. So the Health Security Agency is going to deal with pandemics and what I would call genuine public health problems, things that involve, require collective action, or the environmental hazards, biohazards, and infectious diseases. And then this Office for Health Promotion is going to be looking at what I would describe as the nanny state stuff, trying to get people to eat their greens and make sure they turn the radiators on in winter, and the other stuff that Public Health England was largely preoccupied about. This might be an unfair question because we don't know very much about it, but do we have any idea of if this agency is going to carry on Public Health England's good work with regards to vaping? If we don't have any idea, let's have some comments about what we think it should be doing. Anybody else?
It's funny. So, I mean, there was a bit of concern when it was announced that Public Health England was going to be abolished amongst vapers in the UK, because they see them as a bit of a defensive barrier. They've taken a lot of stick on vaping, but they've done pretty well. They stood their ground against all the brickbats thrown at them. Now, personally, I'm not particularly enamored with some of the other things they're doing, but on vaping, they got it absolutely spot on. But they've been fairly quiet on it since this pandemic's been around and since that announcement was made. So it remains to be seen, I think, whether some of the same personnel who are involved in the tobacco group in Public Health England, which has that very sound opinion on harm reduction and vaping, whether they'll materialise somewhere in this new group. If they do, then hopefully for harm reduction, it'll be business as usual. But obviously the fear is if they just bring in people who've got a completely different idea of things. But I suppose it's yet to be seen. But I'd be more optimistic to think that some of those people will end up in this new administration.
Clive, any thoughts?
Yeah, I pretty much echo what Martin says. I mean, this reorganisation is a little bit of, common sort of government machinery changes. The different functions carry on much as they were and just move around into different office blocks and different different nameplates. So I'm optimistic that the good things will continue. One of the good things that Public Health England has done is to do these annual evidence reviews, which it usually commissions from King's College, the expert group there. The next and final one that have been commissioned is due in 2022, and that's going to revisit the famous at least 95% less risky thing. So that's going to be a big one. It's going to be done jointly with Americans. So they're going to be continuing that work. What I hope is that they'll offer another contract and continue that stream of really quite good reports with different thematic focuses coming out every year. Mental health, pregnancy, heat not burn was one focus. And if they keep doing that and they keep putting forward, working with the sort of health infrastructure, they've managed to get really good statements on the NHS website. They've done good work with GPs and things. I think that will be good, and I'm pretty confident they will, because it's seen as a success in the government.
Mark, have you got any inside information about this organisation?
No, I haven't. I get loads of emails from Matt Hancock drop into my inbox, but I haven't seen one giving us the rationale behind this. But there's Public Health England at a senior level, and there's Public Health England we can engage with at a more local level. And I certainly found that when I went to the smoking cessation service within my local authority, and chatted to them about how vaping could help. And I think that attitudes have changed tremendously from just talking to people about gum and patches and those routes to Public Health England and to the use of vaping through local smoking cessation services. And I remember going back to the early stages of our APPG, we had a public health professional from Leicestershire who was very courageous in putting her head over the parapet and saying, look, all these other things, the people I'm talking to that want to stop have tried all this, and the thing that I really find only works effectively is vaping. And we know that on the ground there will be more people recognizing that, and so maybe we need to encourage that from the ground upwards policy within the organisation, as well as making certain that through our reports to the All Party Group we get those at the top of the organisation. There needs to be attacking it from both levels.
Thanks. Yeah, and I should give a special recommendation to all you people on YouTube to watch the video from Yorkshire Cancer Research speaking about local initiatives. Absolutely brilliant half-hour film about vaping. Clive Bates is in it. Various other people are in it. It's well worth a watch. Let's go to the questions, and here's one from our friend in Sweden who says the recent Swedish government proposal said that there is not any evidence that nicotine products, be they snus, vaping, nicotine pouches, are linked to lower smoking prevalence. And this comes from the only country in the EU where snus is legal. And in fact, as we've already heard, Sweden has the lowest smoking prevalence rate in the EU by a country mile. So he says, it seems that smoking and cancer are no longer the political problems, rather it's nicotine. Your comments, anybody?
I'd like to.
Fine.
I mean, one of the most perplexing and insane things in Europe is Sweden's refusal to own its own public health triumph. I mean, it's not just that the smoking rates are anomalously low in Sweden, and they are. Current smoking is 7% in that Eurobarometer study that you mentioned, Chris, against the EU average of 23%. Okay, now there is no other explanation for this in Sweden other than the fact that roughly, nicotine use is not that different to the sort of EU average, but it's all being done, particularly amongst men, but increasingly amongst women, through snus. And it's not only the effect on smoking that you can measure, it's been going on long enough now that you can see it in the disease outcomes. So the great, expert on this, Lars Ramstrom, has gone into all the tobacco-related diseases, cancer, oral cancer. So, people say, is it just oral cancer instead of lung cancer? No, if you go into all the diseases, COPD, heart disease and everything, you see a much lower burden of smoking-related disease as well, or tobacco-related disease as well. I don't know where they get the idea there's no evidence from. There's a ton of evidence. It's all been presented to the Swedish government, to the EU, to everybody. But it's one of these problems. They decided they didn't like it back in the late 1980s. A lot of that came from Britain. And, it's almost as if tobacco policy is on a ratchet. It only goes one way. And it's as though they think, well, we're heading towards a tobacco or a nicotine-free society. We've got this little win here. Let's keep that one over the pocket. And then, we'll come, we're halfway there. We've done some of what we need to do. Whereas actually what it is doing is obstructing a move to a much safer nicotine market elsewhere in Europe, where, currently snus is banned. So it's one of the worst EU policies ever. The UK, unfortunately, has supported it from the outset and resisted it when there was a court challenge, resisted the resistance to it when there was a court challenge. But that statement that there's no evidence that it's making a difference is just total nonsense. Total nonsense.
I'd just like to say, I think it just shows the strength of the tobacco control lobby and where they are and where they're repelled by anything that could have tobacco in it. I mean, Clive spoke about this court case. It's quite laughable that you have Sweden who, when they joined the EU, they negotiated a carve out of the ban on snus because they realised they probably wouldn't get across the line in the referendum if they joined and had to take on the ban. So they carved out this exemption, which is why Sweden is the only country in the EU which is allowed to, where snus is legal. And now they seem to be fighting against it. When they had that court case, the NNA were an intervener in this court case. And they flat out denied that snus was responsible for the low smoking rates, and instead came out with this weird nonsense about how increased paternity leave was responsible because more fathers were at home, so they didn't smoke around their kids as much. It was nothing to do with snus. I mean, the level of cognitive dissonance going on this is quite hilarious. Just last week at this Westminster Hall debate that Mark spoke about, Joe Churchill stood up and said they're not going to do anything on snus because it's harmful. And yet, if you look at the harm profile of snus, it's safer than e-cigarettes. And she was in there saying how brilliant e-cigarettes are and what a great success story they are. But snus is safer than e-cigarettes. And yet there seems to be this inertia on allowing snus to be sold. I mean, it just beggars belief, and it is just evidence, I think, of how tobacco control just doesn't like anything to do with tobacco. And like Clive said, the debate should be combustible or non-combustible. That's where the saving and harm is. It's just bizarre.
I think there's this view that the harm is in nicotine, and the harm isn't in nicotine. The harm in combustible tobacco is the gases that are produced when ignition takes place, and those are drawn into the lung. And I think Martin and Clive will perhaps confirm that nicotine in itself is certainly addictive. There's no question of that. But in terms of harm, it's no more harmful than caffeine. And we all drink several cups of coffee a day.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about thinking on the margin, as so often in public policy. Yeah, snus is harmful. Yeah, maybe it is, but it's about the difference in the risk profile. Come to the next question. Actually, before I do, I'll just mention that there is, of course, one other country in Europe which has a smoking rate at 7%, and that's Norway. And snus, of course, is legal also in Norway. So the evidence really is mounting up on that one. The question is that the health costs of tobacco consumption fall heavily on the least well off. What should our policy be to address this? I'll add that it's not just the health cost, it's the financial costs of tobacco, which are, of course, very significant these days, £2,000 or £3,000 a year for an average smoker. So what should be, this is, I guess, is a sort of health inequalities question, really. Who wants to take it on? Clive.
Yeah, I mean, there are massive and really, really ugly gradients in smoking prevalence. You know, whether it's deprived areas, mental health status, employment status, educational status, it really is smoking is increasingly concentrated in the poorest, most disadvantaged groups. Obviously, not everybody, but there are strong gradients. And the dominant response, or one of the most, the dominant response to that has been to take out the biggest club of all, which is tobacco taxation, and kind of try and beat it out of them. And if you buy a packet of so-called budget cigarettes now, if you buy Mayfair Super Kings at Tesco, you'll pay £10.50, of which around 80% is taxation. VAT, ad valorem, and specific duties. Okay, so we have something that not only takes something that's very harmful to the body, we then have a policy towards it that actually harms you financially and basically makes it, certainly if you buy legal products, makes a huge dent in the household budget of the people who can least afford it. So we have to recognize there are limits to the sort of cruelty of that sort of policy, even if you think that it's just creating a financial incentive to get people to quit. But above all, I think if you're going to do that sort of thing, you absolutely have to link it to increasing, maximizing the number of options that people have to stop smoking. And one of the best ways to do that, particularly for people who are poorer, is to be very positive about the vaping and other tobacco harm reduction non-combustible alternatives. Not only because they save you a lot of money, they are very much safer, but they're also easier to move to if smoking is entrenched in your life in some way, because they require you to give up less, because they replicate more of the functions of smoking. So I think a humane approach to this would be to double down on the positivity of switching and really focusing that. And Chris, if I could say one more thing, I generally, as a former civil servant, I don't think the government should be, paying, or the taxpayer, if you like, should be paying for people's vaping. If you switch from smoking to vaping, you basically make a saving and you can afford it. But I do think there is a problem with the most vulnerable and the poorest people. And here there is scope for a little intervention to get you started, maybe, to get you over the initial outlay or the uncertainty that you're going to buy the vaping stuff, it's not going to work, and you're going to end up buying the smoking as well. So maybe we could be a bit more generous, considering how much we spend on prescription drugs. We could be a little bit more generous with getting people started on the first rung of the ladder of a transition from smoking to vaping, with GPs or stop smoking services or even vape shops having some sort of discretion to get people moving, a voucher scheme or something like that.
Yeah, Chris, we know that smoking cessation services do make available gums and patches. Those are provided to people who wish to stop smoking, but the vaping device isn't it? I think Clive's quite right. I don't want to see people's vaping habit funded by the taxpayer, but I think something that provides a nudge in the right direction, giving them a decent trial to see whether it works for them, would be in everybody's interest.
Thanks. Goes another question here. E-cigarettes, obviously a great free market solution. But let's talk about the market. What do each of the panelists think will be the next innovation that will take place in tobacco harm reduction? We talked a bit about snus. We talked a lot about e-cigarettes. There are also nicotine pouches around, people might have seen at the counter in shops, and heated tobacco and other things, I dare say. Anyone have any thoughts about where I should be investing my money?
Nicotine pouches have got a lot of potential, but already we're seeing negativity come out around those. These are like snus, they're little pouches of a kind of powder which contains nicotine. So there's no tobacco in them. Most of them are made by tobacco industry though, so again it has a handicap. But I use them myself. I find them very, very interesting, very useful. Yeah, that's it. Those are the things. And we've actually written to the Department of Health, and this much surprise, we're asking for regulation. And the reason we want some regulation is obviously we want light touch regulation, is because there is potential for abuse, and we don't want this to end up like snus, which was basically there was a moral panic in 1984 about skull bandits, which Chris will know all about.
Edwina Curry.
Yeah, Edwina Curry. Yeah, and that led to eventually to the EU ban on snus, which is well, there's no defence for it. It should be lifted immediately. But you're now in that position of trying to fight that case. We don't want to see the same with nicotine pouches. There's lots of potential for them. They're an option for people who don't get on with vaping, just like heated tobacco products are an option for people who don't get on with vaping, and they should have some light up regulation, so just purely so you can enforce rules against people who are unscrupulous and are selling products that that've got cartoon pictures all over them or insane amounts of nicotine in them. They should really be given a fairly easy ride, and hopefully whoever was in Public Health England who is then in this new administration will look kindly on those and put in some sort of regulations in place that mean they can prosper and thrive. The other thing I'd say on innovation, I think unfortunately some of the innovation that we could have is being stopped. The next generation of things, progress is being stopped. Largely because of the EU's TPD, we can't have the 20 mil limit on nicotine, which Mark was talking about. There are products which can deliver much more than that. Which means you can have a smaller battery to deliver the punch that you need to pack to get smokers off, but they're banned in the EU. You can get them in America at the moment, but because the nicotine level is only 20 milligrams, you to get the sort of satisfaction you need from that, you need something big like this. The ideal is if you had a little thing like this that's nice and simple to carry around, and the technology is there. But unfortunately, the nicotine limit means that you can't deliver it to UK people or anyone in the EU. Smokers cannot have that product, but that product exists and is being obstructed by regulations at the moment.
And vaping has demonstrated lots of innovation by the variety of flavours that are brought onto the market. And in some ways, I think it's been a victim of its own success, because in some cases, there is evidence that flavours have been developed which have been more attractive to younger consumers than to adult consumers. We were talking earlier about what had restricted the growth and development of the sector. We did have a phase where there was concern that younger people were trying vaping with a view to sticking with it as a way of getting a nice sweet taste when previously that had consumed confectionery. So the innovation needs to be used positively, and for people who do want variety in their lives, and people do, once they've had one flavour, many of them will move on to others. Others will stick with one flavour and never deviate. I don't know whether that's Martin or not, sticking with one flavour or moving around, but the innovation can exist within the product.
Go on, Clive.
Yeah, I mean, I almost think that the innovations within the products themselves are like a second order issue. Those will happen if the framework for innovation is right. In other words, you can try things, bring them to market. If they're successful with consumers, you can do more of it. If the consumer's saying turn off, you stop it, and so on. So you have to, the innovation that's needed is to continue to be able to bring products to market quickly, test them in consumers, market them, communicate them, really. So having a pro-innovation environment is the sort of like meta level innovation. The other area where I think we need more innovation would be in policy and communications. So, I mean, the Public Health England, Royal College of Physicians, at least 95% lower risking. That's an innovation. It's an innovation in the communication sphere. It's an attempt for experts who have a lot of very diffuse knowledge about this to come together with a coherent message that works with healthcare people, the public, policymakers, and the media. It's an innovation. But I think there's scope for other innovations. So, for example, it would be good to see the government, through Public Health England, produce a series of approved statements about vaping or the non-combustible products. And this was an idea that was floated in Canada for a while, but as the moral panic spread from the United States to Canada, was ditched. But it would be a series of category-wide generic statements. E-cigarettes are much less harmful than smoking. If they could just get themselves into a position where they could say these things, which are basically true beyond any reasonable doubt, but say them with official weight and without individual companies having to kind of prove it somehow, that would be a major innovation. So that's where I would look for innovation, in the policy environment that encourages product innovation, and in the communications environment, which encourages people to understand these products better.
Thanks. We're nearly out of time, and I do want to finish on time so people can get down the park with their bag of cans before it gets dark. I'm just going to combine two questions together for our kind of closing remarks. Somebody has asked, is there any danger the government might do something mad on vaping like Australia did by banning e-cigarettes altogether? And somebody else says, you have touched on this, but in a word, can the UK retain its crown as world leader in harm reduction policies? What will each of the panelists personally be doing to help ensure that we are? So really, that's the question. Is there a danger of the government doing something mad, and what are you personally going to do to stop it? Martin, let's start with you.
I don't think this country would go as far as Australia, which is truly mad. But you should always remain vigilant. You can't just assume that the government's got your back. Many people do, and it really intensely annoys me because anything can happen, and politics is a fickle beast, isn't it? And so you've got to be worried about any threats that come in, and you should fight against them. If you're a consumer, fight against anything you perceive as a threat, because you don't want to get a position where you've decided, you know what, actually we're quite safe, and you do nothing, and next thing you know, oh my God, what's happened? You know, smokers made this mistake with menthol cigarettes. I know a number of smokers who went down a shop one day and all of a sudden they couldn't get menthol cigarettes. And I said, well, yeah, they banned them about 4 years ago, but it only just come in. What did you do about it? And they didn't. They just maybe read about it somewhere and didn't do anything. So these things can happen. I don't think it'd be like Australia, but you have to remain vigilant. On the subject of what to do to keep the UK ahead, we made some recommendations, lift the snus ban, we should double down on harm reduction, if anything. Lift the snus ban, allow more advertising. Like Mark said, get rid of the 20 ml limit, get rid of the stupid little bottles and the small tank sizes. Warnings. This silly thing, I bought a new. This is basically a plastic box which has got that warning on it. This product contains nicotine. It's a plastic box with a circuit board on it. I mean, ridiculous. Allow producers to make health claims. That people who make e-cigarettes are not allowed to say these things are 95% safer or anything like that. Just not allowed, even though it's true. And the last one, the most bizarre, is the people who make Silk Cut JTI. They're not allowed to put an insert in the pack saying, "Have you tried our Logic e-cigarette instead?" I mean, that's actually illegal. Why have we got these rules? Get rid of them all and just go more heavily on harm reduction and invite people to take up something safer.
Thank you. Clive?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I don't think we're going to get into a mad place, because there's and it's quite unusual actually, but there's a sort of critical mass of kind of experts in the UK, sort of key universities and main institutions who are basically pretty robust with the evidence, pretty well understand what's going on, because there's enough of them. None of them are made to feel like pariahs or bullied by, the sort of enforcer types that you have in Australia or California. So I think it'll be difficult for the government to move away from that, particularly if Public Health England continues with the kind of personnel and the insights that it has. I agree completely with Martin. The question is whether we can, not really whether we'll go backwards, but whether we're capable of taking it to the next level, which the government will need to do. If you look at the ideas from traditional tobacco control groups for how they would get to the government's target, 2030 target of 5% smoking, they're pathetic, basically. There's almost nothing to them. It's like spend more on smoking cessation services. I mean, not necessarily a bad thing, but the idea that there'll be game changers and create twice the rate of decline that we saw in the last decade is just implausible. So the strategy that's available to them is to double down on harm reduction, all the non-combustibles, and really max that strategy. And that involves them actually liberalizing and deregulating some of the silly things that have been done in the past, and really pressing to get people to take whatever works for them as long as it's non-combustible.
Great, thank you. Mark, the final word is yours.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should underestimate the strength of vapers as a community. The Public Health England report that came out last month says there are 2.7 million adult vapers, and given the awareness of the Tobacco Products Directive that it came from the EU, I'm pretty certain that in a lot of areas that directive was one of the reasons why some people chose to vote to leave the EU rather than retain. I speak as somebody who was on the retain side of the argument. There were people who felt so passionate about wanting to be able to continue vaping that was a reason for wanting to leave the EU. So there is that's a strong community now, and I think the job of the APPG and consumer organisations such as the one Martin represents will bring those people together, which means that we won't lose the position that we've previously held. And I do think, I mean, the debate that we held in Parliament last week was a 30-minute debate. It was oversubscribed. There were far more people wanting to speak in it than was time available. And to be fair to the Public Health Minister, Jo Churchill, she did say it might be a good idea for us to have a more detailed debate here in Parliament about the impact of any changes on vaping. So what I should be doing with others is trying to get a bigger, longer debate so that we can continue to push these issues. And so I think, therefore, that the attitudes that we've had from public health in the UK should be maintained. And I'll be doing my best to ensure that it remains a priority in Parliament.
Thank you very much. Well, we've had a slightly longer debate this evening, and thank you all three of you very much indeed for joining us and giving us your thoughts. Most interesting. Thank you everybody for watching. We've got lots and lots of videos here on the IEA YouTube channel, so please do like and subscribe. Get on there, have a look at the schedule. There's plenty more coming up over the course of the next week or so. I'm doing something next Tuesday, in fact. So tune in for that and all the other stuff we do. If you are a donor and supporter of the IA, then it's thanks to you that we can do all this stuff. If you're not a donor, but you'd like to become a donor, please go to iea.org.uk/donate and give us whatever you can afford. The parks are open, the beaches are open. Get yourself down there now. See you later. Thank you very much. Goodbye.